All right, here we are back from our break, and we're ready for the Vikings in week 1, lecture 2, the origins of the Vikings. Okay. We're going to look for the next hour and 20 minutes at the origins of the Vikings. Where did they come from, and how did they develop before they became Vikings? And remember that the Viking Age was 750 to about 1050 AD, and so we're going to bring them up to that point where they actually are Vikings. So that's what we're going to do now. The origins of the Vikings are among the Indo-Europeans. Vikings are Indo-Europeans, a group of people who originated in the Caucasus Mountains. And I'm going to show you, in fact, I will just turn over and come back to that. The Caucasus Mountains are right in this region right here between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. Well, what's there today? Does anybody know what's there today? What is in that region? No, it's north of that. Iraq is here. It's about Chechnya or Afghanistan. That's kind of the region that the Indo-Europeans began in. And there's a very complicated kind of study of how you can locate them there. It's through linguistic studies, and largely linguistic studies, and also studies of the flora and fauna there that they had words for. And they went in all different directions. There are in fact groups that went all the way to Siberia that were part of Siberia. There were groups that went all the way to western China. And in fact, there are a set of mummies that were found in that area about 10 years ago with blonde hair and with horses and with Indo-European culture. So they went all the way there. They were in Siberia. A group of them went here. The Persians or Iranians are Indo-European in origin, and also in India the Sanskrit and Hindi are Indo-European languages, and so those people are usually called the Aryans. The Hittites were a very early group that went into the Middle Eastern world here. The Greeks are Indo-Europeans. The Romans are Indo-Europeans. There is a group of what are called Celtiberians who settled in Spain. The Celts settled all across Europe in this area, also in England. And the Balts went up in this region. The Balts are the Lithuanians, the Latvians, those people in that area. And the Finns are not Indo-European. They're Finno-Ugric is their language grouping, which is related to Turkish. But the Lithuanians and the Latvians are Indo-Europeans, and of course the Scandinavians, and then the Germans who later came down from Scandinavia into Europe, and they were all Indo-Europeans, the kind of dispersion of the Indo-Europeans. So here are all the ones who went east, here are all the ones who went west. The Canaanites might have been Indo-Europeans. Scholars are not sure, archaeologists aren't sure yet whether the Canaanites are Indo-Europeans, or they might have been half Greek, but people aren't sure. So these are all the ones. The Slavs, by the way, are Indo-European as well. All the Indo-Europeans have a common culture, and one of the interesting things about it is it's based on threes. Often Indo-European people think in terms of threes for some reason. They organize in groups of threes. And one thing that's common to Indo-European culture is that the political system is more important than religion. And think for a really good example of the Greeks. When the Greeks came into the Middle Eastern world, they were very different from the peoples who already lived there in the Mesopotamian River Valley and in Egypt, and those people were very, very religious, and the Greeks were not. They were also a warrior people, and Indo-Europeans are warrior peoples, and they're more interested in politics than in religion. Their government was quite different as well. They had elected kings, and they could either be kings or war chiefs or war leaders. And their word king didn't have the connotations that a king does now. I mean, it was quite a different word. It was more of a war leader or a war chief. And the king or the war chief could be deposed. If he didn't do a good job, they could throw him out. And this isn't necessarily true of a lot of the other surrounding cultures. Usually in the Indo-European groups, there was a warrior aristocracy from which the king is elected, a group of ruling families who were more prominent, and then there would be an assembly of all free warriors, and usually it's the assembly of warriors who could vote on peace or war, and again I'm casting the net very broadly to look at the broad similarities between them. Normally, Indo-European cultures had slaves, but the slaves weren't part of this tripartite culture. This is the three parts, and the slaves were below that society. The slaves were conquered people and were not included in their society as sort of part of the three-part society. Okay, so we look at our diaspora here. And the Indo-Europeans were apparently the first people to domesticate horses. For example, there were no horses at all in the Middle Eastern world until the Indo-Europeans came into that region. They brought with them the domesticated horse, and this was true of the people that went to China as well, where they found those mummies not long ago, and all of these Indo-European groups had horses. The second thing that they brought with them was something new, the spoked wheel. Okay, the wheel was in the ancient world and in China before the Indo-Europeans came, but the spoked wheel, you have a wheel, and they had solid wheels, but the spokes make the wheel much lighter, and this is the reason that, for example, the Greeks and the Romans had chariots, because they could use these spoked wheels. The third thing that the Indo-Europeans brought with them wherever they went was metalworking. They were metalworking cultures, and they were the first ones to bring bronze into the ancient world, and later waves of them brought ironworking. And so they were great innovators with metalworking. It appears, and there was an article recently in the New York Times about this, that they had different from all the other people of the world, and is that Indo-European people can tolerate milk and cheese and dairy products beyond infancy, which other peoples cannot in the world. They're so-called lactose intolerant. And this is looked at, the New York Times article called it a genetic abnormality. But what about the advantages of such a genetic mutation? I mean, can you think of any advantages to it, to having that kind of a...
Those foods are really calorie rich.
Pardon?
So those foods are really calorie rich.
They're very calorie rich, yeah. What was yours?
A better diet gives better survival rates.
A better diet. Why would the diet be better? I mean, just calories and fat in the milk, or what?
Yeah, the fat content, because that was hard to get back then.
Sure. But calcium. How about calcium? There was a big article in the New York Times just last week about how important calcium is to children as they're growing up, and how important it is to have milk and cheese and yogurt and all those products. And so it struck me as I read it, thinking, you know, I wonder, I mean, and it's true that if you look at all the cultures of the world and who developed cheese, and cheese is all among the Indo-European groups. and they develop it because they're lactose tolerant. I mean, they can eat it. And cheese, the advantage of cheese is it's calorie rich, it has a lot of protein, it has a lot of calcium in it, and you can store it for a long time, and it keeps. I mean, it's a way of taking milk and storing it and being able to keep it and hold it for a long time. And so it gave the Indo-European groups a big advantage in their culture to have this resource that other people didn't have. So that's pretty interesting, I think, as well. And they also have a tripartite religious structure. And if you look at all the groups of gods, whether it's the Greeks or the Romans or the Aryans who went into India, or the Persians who and their religion is Zoroastrianism in Iran, they have a tripartite structure with 3 chief gods at the top, and they tend to organize things in threes. Originally, all the Indo-Europeans had a common language, or from that group where they originated, they had a common language. And you can sort of, I didn't spend a whole lot of time today going through all the linguistics of it, but I could think of a few words, and where we can still see these roots where they all come together in the most basic words like mother and father. Okay, mother is English, of course. Mater, what is that? Latin, yeah. Mère, French. Mutter, German. Mother, Old Norse. Okay, and here are the same ones, except that I couldn't remember the German word for father. Did I get that right? Is it Vater? It's Vater. I knew that wasn't right. Okay, that Vater. Yeah, but it's a V. Okay, that's why I did it wrong. All right, and so Vater. This little symbol is like a soft TH. Okay. This is a soft TH, yeah, in Old Norse and in Old Anglo-Saxon England. And so we can see the similarities in those words where they're basically the same word. Okay, and here we see some horsemen on these rock cuttings that are some of the most ancient artifacts of the Scandinavians in the area of Norway and Sweden. And so you can see these horsemen coming in with their spears in this oldest of the rock carvings. And here is an example of a spoked wheel that is an archaeological remain. Here's some metalworking. These are spurs that would have to do with horsemanship as well. And then here we see on a runic stone a representation of a horse and wagon. I'm showing you Viking examples, but we could show a Greek chariot, and it would show this Indo-European development. And we can still see the influence in the Indo-European culture. Here is Odin's horse, and Odin is one of the 3 chief gods. Odin's horse has 8 legs, so he can fly. So we can see Odin's horse. Okay, here are some other linguistic similarities. Agni is the Hindu god of fire in Sanskrit and Latin. I can't remember this. Agnus or Agnius is fire. Agnius? Ignis. Okay. See, that's an E, right? It's an I. Okay. All right. I was doing this sort of off the top of my head, but I looked these up. Okay, the Greek gods, the god Zeus is the chief of the Greek gods, and the Latin word for God is Deus. The Sanskrit for God is Dia, which is a sky god like Zeus. The Norse Tyr actually comes from this because the Latin god that is correlate to Zeus is Jupiter, and the Tyr is reflected in the Norse Tyr and the German Zeo and Tius. And so you can see the relationship, the linguistic relationships. Zeus, Thor, and Indra, this would be Greek, Viking, and Hindu. are thunder wielders, so we see all that common thing. They're sky gods. Indo-Europeans, because they're nomads, they tend to have sky gods, and so their chief gods tend to be sky gods. And here I compared the letter 1, and I can compare, I actually have a list that that is my source that I'm calling on for here. I can't show it on the air because it's copyrighted, but I have all the Indo-European languages and the numbers in them. And I've done a sample here. Here is the original reconstructed Indo-European is oinos, and we have 1 in English, unus in Latin, Odin in Russian, and Odin, by the way, is one of the gods of he's one of the first gods of the Indo-European of the Vikings. En in Danish, Yek in Persian, and Ekos in Sanskrit. And this Yek and Ekos, actually, there is an evolution that goes through, for example, in Bulgarian, Eden, and Polish, Yedin, and you can see how that evolves from Odin to Yek and Ekos. Because one letter will change as the evolution goes on. And here is duo for 2 in Indo-European, reconstructed, 2 in English, duo in Latin, dua, and the V is pronounced as a U in Russian, 2 in Danish, or toe, or do in Persian, and dwa in Sanskrit. So you can see how these really basic core words are related in Indo-European. Here's some more examples.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Odin is also commonly referred to as Wotan. Which ethnic variant is that?
Odin and Wotan. Well, let me write that down, and you can sort of see Odin and Wotan. You can see that you only have a change of 2 letters here. Really, the O and the Wo are about the same, and D transfers to T and I to A. That's a very easy linguistic thing.
Freshen that pen up.
Oh, okay, thank you. Can't see that very well. Okay.
Aren't the days of the week named after these gods, like Woden's Day and Thor's Day?
Yes. In English, the days of the weeks come from these. Thursday is Thor's Day, Wednesday is Woden's Day, or Odin's Day. Woden and Odin are the same guy, same god, yeah. Does that answer your question? The pronunciation is so alike that when you learn to write things down, these groups write them down slightly differently, but they're pronouncing them in very similar ways. Can you see how that happens?
Yes, so I'm assuming that it's Norse then. Would it not be the Celtic variant, perhaps?
I think it's German.
What is Woden is German.
Wotan.
Wotan.
In Wagner? Oh, you can't Wotan.
Oh, okay. Right. Okay, Wotan. Yeah. But they're all pronounced, but you see, here are the 3 forms, and they're almost identical, but you can see that the letters change just slightly. But they change, over a long, it's just like the difference between a New York accent and a Southern accent, right? Okay, when you hear people pronounce words with a Southern accent or with a Brooklyn accent, and they sound sometimes like they're really different words. And if you were to spell them phonetically by the way they sound, you would spell them differently. And that's kind of how the language evolves. And then by the time people learn to write things down, they're writing them down slightly differently. Yeah. Because the sound of one letter will change, and then so you have to make them change. But that was a really good question to see how these gods evolve and their names, but they're quite similar. And I was going to mention the 10. Okay, in Indo-European it's decum or decum, or 10 in English, decum in Latin, pronounced exactly like this one but spelled slightly different. Desyat in Russian, T in Danish, da in Persian, dasan in Sanskrit. You can see how similar all of that is. And taking the example of 100, I don't know how to pronounce that. I'm not going to try. Kumtum in Indo-European, 100, but kentum in Latin, sto in Russian, that's really sort of far out, but 100 in Danish, sad in Persian, and satam. But you can see how the C changes from a hard K, kentem in Latin, to a soft C that becomes an S, satam in Sanskrit. So anyway, I just wanted to illustrate that the linguistic qualities that unify these cultures, we're not talking about racial groups, okay, because the reason why is because they spread out everywhere, and everywhere they went they intermarried. But the language, the linguistic groups remained, and so they're linguistic groupings, and we find them by their linguistics, by their language. It's a language relationship. 12,000 years ago, these Indo-Europeans reached Scandinavia, and they began hunting and gathering and fowling and fishing. These are called the Fosna folk, and they had entered from the south. They were Stone-Aged people, and they fought with bows and arrows and knives, and they had scrapers and harpoons and spears. They developed a skin boat, and the first known tamed animals that we saw among these Scandinavians are those big wolf-like dogs. And remember, we looked at our little cave carvings, and I pointed out to you that I thought some of those were dogs on there. They buried their dead in shallow graves close to the living, and so we still have the remains of the Fosna folk. Okay, and here is Scandinavia, a kind of close-up if we can look. And I'm sorry I colored that, because we're really only talking about this area here and this area here in the Stone Age, and Denmark, this area here, because only in the Viking Age at 750 AD were these areas settled. But the original Scandinavian areas were just in here because it's warmer and it's closer to the coast. And the coastline, the sea, is very central to this Scandinavian culture. And here are our rock carvings again. And here you can see, I wanted to show you this again. These carvings are on the sides of mountains, so you can see how big they are. And here are the carvings that are there. And one thing we can notice, these are very, very ancient. These are the most ancient remains of the Scandinavians. Notice that we have boats in the very earliest cave carvings, and I think these are dogs. I really think these are dogs. Maybe that's a squirrel. Look at its tail. Now this might be a horse being transported on a boat, and but I'm not sure, but these larger ones. But here's a man, and these little ones look like dogs to me. Here's some more. Let's have a look and see what we think maybe we're seeing here. What do you see? I'm sorry I didn't blow this up a little bigger, but maybe Don can focus down on it a little more in the middle. What do you see there? We see hunters. This guy's got a horned helmet on. We see ships. This looks like a snake. These look like dogs. This might be a herd of sheep or something, because they had sheep that early. And certainly they had chickens and ducks and geese. Okay, so we might see those. Your guess is as good as mine, I mean, or any archaeologist, because we don't know. I mean, all we have are the drawings, and we have to figure out what they are. Okay, we can sort of pan out and see this one. What kinds of things do we see here? Might be a cow. Yeah, that might be a cow, because it looks like a cow with its horns. Good. Anything else you see there? We've got a bow and arrow. Okay, we've got a bow and arrow represented. This might be a snake. boats. What do you think that is? A what? It looks to me like a reindeer. Don't those look like antlers to you? Might be a reindeer. Now this looks like something, little boats all lined up in a row. That's pretty interesting. Now this is something that you see on a lot of carvings. It's a sun symbol, and this is real. This is something that is really prominent in this very Stone Age and Bronze Age culture. Are sun symbols? Why do you suppose that is? Because they like the warmth. Yeah, don't forget to press your mic.
Because,
Okay.
I mean, since you mentioned that they were nomads and their big thing was the sky, it's a point of reference for them, since, I mean, you know, usually they would be roaming across the landscape during the day. It would be a very sort of important symbol, and also would help mark the seasons for them.
It would mark the seasons, and the seasons are very important in that northern part of the world. That's the land of the midnight sun, right? The midnight sun is there in summer, but in winter, the sun is gone for long periods of time, and so they would have this particular affinity to the sun when they have the warmth, and so this is true of the earliest cultures. Sun symbols are everywhere like that. And here we have these guys with axes. It looks like they've got axes. I don't know if they're fighting or chopping down trees or making these boats, but that's kind of interesting. And we have maybe they're fighting over this wheel, which is what this says, two men fighting for a wheel. Well, who knows if that's what they're fighting for. It says plowing. Where is the plowing? Here is the plowing. Is a man plowing. That's kind of interesting that he's plowing. You know, that needs more study. That's pretty interesting. Anyway, these rock carvings, you just, you know, there they are. You have to figure out what they are, and historians who study them have to figure out what they are. What do you see in this one?
Another reindeer.
These are clearly reindeer, aren't they? So now they've moved to the north and they have tamed reindeer. Okay, they've added something else to their repertoire. I still insist that these are dogs. I really think they're dogs. And look here, we have a duck or a goose over here. You see that? A duck or a goose. And then we have boats again. We've got a snake for sure. So the snake is over here. This might be a goose over here. I don't think that's a dachshund. I think it's a I think it's an idiosyncrasy of the carver. But anyway. But there are hundreds of these cave paintings to try to figure out, you know, they're not cave paintings, they're carvings on the rock. And so to try to figure out what in the world they are. This one looks almost like a Greek key, doesn't it? Or a snake in a very odd form. It's so squared off. That is really odd, you know. But archaeologists study this and try to figure out what these rock carvings mean. Okay, here are some of these graves, and these are quite interesting graves that are built with these rocks. And the reason they're so interesting is because these are the kind of rock graves that are typical of the people of the Caucasus, of that region. And so these are the same kinds of graves that are built up with a stone on top. Okay. Okay, these people we're looking at are the parent Scandinavians, and their cultures are parallel to those of the Lapps of Finnmark and the Finns and the Lapps in Finland. And also among the Norse of the day we're looking at. They are northward-looking people, and they face the Arctic. This culture is called the Kamsa culture. Its origins are unknown. There are 10,000 years of northern prehistory, and all of this time in prehistory they are hunters and fishers and clearers of forest, they are stock minders and crop raisers. And they live in this incredibly harsh environment where there are fjords and ice and snow and long winters and short summers. How might this environment influence Norse development? Has anybody lived in northern climates, really northern snow and ice and rocky high mountains? And it's a very difficult climate. Keeping warm is very difficult. But you know, that's really funny. There's a Swedish saying, there's no such thing as bad weather, there's only bad clothing. Isn't that an interesting saying? So that it's a kind of optimism that they can overcome everything. And I personally believe that there's a kind of survival of the fittest going on, the Darwinian survival, that, I mean, it really takes tough people to survive in this kind of an environment, in this kind of climate and atmosphere, and that over a long period of time it built really strong people, very healthy people too. And to this day, I mean, the Scandinavians are very long-lived. The only weakness, one weakness they have is because of the long winters, and there's more alcoholism in the Scandinavian countries than there is in any other country. So that's a hazard, you know, to live in that. But they're very strong, they're very healthy and sturdy and long-lived, and so this worked toward their survival. Here is a map of Iceland. Actually, this is northern Iceland, and you can see this is Norway is just like this, and so is parts of Sweden's on the coast, where you see these fjords going in and these high mountains and rivers, and so they fish and they eat salmon and they live in the ice and snow, and they trap animals, and they have furs, and it's a very harsh environment, but they survive in it. This is Norway, and so you can sort of see the environment, and this is in the summertime, of course. You don't see the snow. Here's Hammerfest in Norway, a little village, a little fishing village. If you could sort of block out the modern buildings, you might see this from Scandinavian times. Here are some drawings of the countryside, and these are actually grave mounds in upland in Sweden, but you can see the lay of the land. It's rather sparsely forested, and you have pine trees, but you also have forests of elm and oak and ash, and so this is the environment that they live in. This is actually in Iceland as well, but it still gives you an idea of what the Scandinavian environment. One reason they stayed across the northern hemisphere is everything across there, Norway and Iceland and Scotland and Greenland, they have this similar kind of climate and similar kind of geography. And so it attracted the Vikings to go to that area. Here is some more of the countryside that you can see kind of what it looks like with the trees and the forest and the mounds that the Vikings set for their graves. Or not the Vikings, the pre-Vikings. By 1500 BC, the Bronze Age was underway, and there is evidence from physical anthropology of a Nordic racial type. The Nordic racial type is very tall and very long-headed and very tall. But in Scandinavia, there are, in fact, two racial types that are there. There is the Nordic type that is tall and long-headed and usually blonde, and there is a shorter, darker, round-headed type, and they're intermingled, but the Nordic type tends to be more predominant. The farther north you go and the farther south you go, the more predominant the shorter, darker, round-headed type becomes more predominant. There are village settlements in Varangefjord, Oslo Fjord, And Denmark was the earliest area to prosper. It was entering a period of comparative wealth and creativity foretelling the future. There are just hundreds of Bronze Age weapons and personal ornaments. It's very clear that Denmark traded amber for tin and copper. The sun image of Trondheim appears everywhere among the artifacts. There are trumpets that sort of mock or mimic the horns that we have, and there are all these wonderful contemporary rock carvings that we've already seen of barrows and ships beaked at both ends with rowers, but never sails. You notice that the ships we saw, none of the ships had sails. They only had oars. Sun images are everywhere. They're shipborne, they're man-borne, they're drawn by horses, chariots, and wagons. And so the sun images are very important. Here's some of the Bronze Age and Stone Age pottery that we can see, these clay urns that are typical of the pottery. Here is a typical grave. Here is a cutaway version of it so you can see the grave from this angle. And here is the grave with the grave goods sort of lining it around here. All right. And here are some more of the artifacts, the necklace, pottery, some axe heads from the graves, and some larger bronze vessels from the Bronze Age. And here you can see this sun image on the vase that is so prominent and so important. Here's the image of the sun on that one, if you can see that. And if we could maybe scoot over to this one, this is harder to see, but there's a sun image on this one too, if you can see the sun image. And obviously this is one that would attract the Scandinavians. It would be very important to them. So here are these bronze vessels. Here's some more examples of the bronze works. And again, I could just show you these for days on end. There are so many of them. We have bronze. Well, some of these are gold, actually. These are gold. This is a bracelet. And here is the finely worked gold vessel. Here's another bracelet. A spiral ring. And these are pinchers. These are like tweezers, okay, of gold. Can you see how they are? They're tweezers. See how they work? Okay. And here are some more. Here's a bronze. Oh, I've already showed you that one. That's the same one that other one was. All right. Here are some more bronze. Here is a battle horn. This is the trumpet they were talking about, a trumpet, a horn of bronze, and not sure. This is a battle horn also. This is a horn, and so is this. They're rather interesting with a chain ornament. Okay, and here is a boat. Bronze Age boat, and again this would be one that would be rowed and not sailed. Here, these are, interestingly, these are bronze knives. Okay, they're knives that are heavily decorated, but again from this Bronze Age culture. And here are some bronze weapons of all kinds. We've got arrowheads on this side. These are sword hilts, and these are spearheads. So you can see and this is a knife. The various kinds of bronze implements. And here is a knife and some figures. These are knives actually with figures as the handles, which are interesting. I mean, the Bronze Age, this was a huge flowering of culture. They're very ornate, and these are different knives and swords from the Bronze Age. Okay. And here are some shields, and these are typical Viking shields. They're round with a boss in the middle, and on the other side is a handle to hold it. And these are all from the Bronze Age, so that they had these axe heads of various kinds from the Bronze Age. And here is our old friend, the horned helmet, which belongs to the Bronze Age, not to the Viking Age. Here's the kind of clothing that is found as these grave goods. You can see a woolen shawl and a cap and a coarse woolen cloak, a woolen skirt. And here is a lady's outfit, a woman's skirt and bodice of wool. So all of these things are found from the Bronze Age, which continue in the culture as it goes into the next age. After the Bronze Age, there's an economic depression with little gold and silver and few grave offerings and artistic standards in decline. Why? Probably because there's an age of Celtic power and expansion on the Upper Rhine and the Danube basins. There's evidence of a military society with chariots and harness, weapons, and personal adornment. So what happens is that the Celts on the continent of Europe grow much, much stronger, and they block those trade routes to the Vikings. Amber from Prussia now begins to compete with Jutland, and so we see the growing power of the Celts cut down on the wealth of the Vikings, or the pre-Vikings in the north. Probably there was a climatic change, and also the north became colder and wetter. But around this time, we see reports in the Greek and Roman authors of what is happening in the Scandinavian world. There are reports that they write about what's going on. For example, Pythias of Massilia, a Greek geographer, mentions Thule, which is probably in Norway, perhaps a part of the west coast of Norway. He also mentions that the Scandinavians had harder grain, heavier plows, and longer trousers than the Celts to their south. Okay, so we want to look at the Celts at this time of the Greeks. The Celts are growing much stronger here, cutting off the trade routes from Scandinavia and England into the Mediterranean world, which is where all the wealth was coming from. So here is the Greek Empire of the 6th century. From 330 to 300, Pythias made a journey west and north from Cadiz to the Don River. And he said that Thule was 6 days' sail north of Britain, and that barbarians lived there by means of agriculture. He reported that they had few domestic animals, but had millet and herbs, roots and fruits. And he said that they made a fermented drink from grain and honey. What would that have been? Mead, yeah, mead. He describes a sunless environment, and he describes an amber island of Abulus which sold sea products to the Teutones of Jutland. And he mentions the Geutones, which would have been the Goths, and the Cimbres, who are mentioned in the sources as well. Orosius describes the Roman defeat at Orange in 105 BC, and this is quoting Orosius. The enemy, the Cimbri, captured both camps and acquired an enormous quantity of booty. In accordance with a strange and unusual vow, they set about destroying everything which they had taken. Clothing was cut to pieces and cast away. Gold and silver was thrown into the river. The breastplates of the men were hacked to pieces. The trappings of the horses were broken up. The horses themselves drowned in whirlpools, and men with nooses round their necks were hanged from trees. Thus there was no booty for the victors and no mercy for the vanquished. Okay, so this is Orosius as quoted by Jones in the history of the Vikings. there are some interesting features to this passage. In fact, the Vikings did destroy their weapons, and in this period we find in their graves swords that are bent up so that they can't be used anymore, and so they did engage in some kind of destruction of this kind. The mentioning of hanging with nooses is also something that is particularly Scandinavian, that one of their religious rites was to practice human sacrifice by hanging people with nooses. And Odin himself was reported to have hung from a noose on Yggdrasil, the world ash, for 9 days and 9 nights as a sacrifice to acquire the magic of runes. So hanging was a common way of sacrificing. And we can see glimpses in these Greek passages of the actual Scandinavian culture. Strabo, another Greek, wrote in the 1st century BC, and this is what he reported, that their priestesses were ancient women robed in white who decked their captives with garlands of flowers and led them to a huge bronze cauldron. Each man stood on a step or ladder, and each man would be a captive, standing on a step or ladder and suspended over the cauldron. The priestess then cut his throat so that the blood flowed into the cauldron as both a sacrifice and an augury. And an augury is foretelling the future through the blood. So here is a tale of human sacrifice. And in fact, in the 1st century BC, I don't know why I have this map here, at the time of the Roman Empire, they would have those, but here are the kind of weapons they had, and here are the bent swords where they bend them all up so that nobody could use them again. I wanted to show you those. Here are some more of those bent swords showing the destruction of weapons when they die. This one is particularly destroyed. This is a cauldron. This is a particularly interesting, huge silver cauldron that might be like the cauldron they were talking about in the passage. Just such a scene also of this human sacrifice with the cauldron is portrayed on one of the panels of a silver bowl from Gundestrup. The bowl itself is probably just such a receptacle. But other peoples were by now on the move. The Langobards left Skane and ended up in Italy. The Burgundians, who might have been from Bornholm or Borgundarholm, ended up in northeast Germany. The Rugi, possibly of Rogaland, went to the Baltic, and the Goths, the Oster and Vastergoths, might have come from Oster and Västergotland in Sweden, or the island of Gotland. This should be Gotland rather than Gotland. And they went to North Germany. The power of the Celts was now on the wane, and these tribes from Scandinavia were moving into the former Celtic lands. They are we call them the Germans, okay, but they came from Scandinavia. Posidonius of Apamea, who flourished 130 to 5 BC, mentions the Germani pressing southward, and they said they came from Skansa, a big island in the north. Jordanus called it the factory of peoples and the matrix of nations. And this is the very point when the Christian era begins. It is a Roman era from 1 to 400 AD. Now the Celtic power is gone. The Germans are there where the Celts were before, and they act as an intermediary, a contact with the Scandinavians who remain in Scandinavia. The southern influences now reach the north again. Remember, they were there in the Bronze Age, and then they disappeared when the Celts were strong. Now the southern Mediterranean influences are back, and we see an economic recovery in Scandinavia. The kingdom of the Marcomanni is in modern Bohemia. Two great trade routes proceed northward along the Elbe to Jutland and the Vistula to the Baltic and Sweden. And the eastern route from the Black Sea through Russia is important after 200 AD. The western sea route from Gaul by the way of the Rhine and Frisia now becomes important. Okay, here is the Roman Empire, and the Celtic power is gone. The Germans are moving into this area. Some are being incorporated into the Roman Empire, some are on the boundaries, but these rivers, like this river, the Elbe here, and the Vistula over here, now open up the trade routes again to the Mediterranean, and Scandinavia becomes wealthy once again, and we see the Roman Empire here. Zealand stood to benefit the most, and Zealand is in Denmark. Okay, art production increased, and treasures from Rome reached Scandinavia. The Swedish ore was derived from the Roman aureus, and the ore that's still what the coin in Sweden is called, the ore. And the Roman aureus was the name of the Roman gold coin, so Scandinavia got the name of its coinage from the Roman Empire. Cremation is found persisting, but inhumation or burial on the Roman model is also seen in the graves. Men and women were buried in splendor once again with silver and gold artifacts. Roman goods were exchanged for skins and furs, amber, sea ivory, and slaves. The profits of trade combined with the profits of war. In fact, the Roman emperors Augustus and Nero sent fleets to the Baltic, and the Germans sent ambassadors to Rome itself. And there was so much trade there that one of the interesting things is that in this period, it was the height of fashion for Roman women to wear blonde wigs imported from Scandinavia, from Scandinavian blonde hair. And so that is just one influence, and you can see the trade going back and forth. It's during this time, at about in the 300s, in fact, that the German fashion of wearing trousers was adopted by the Romans. And there was one Roman emperor called Caracalla, and that was a nickname. Let me write that down. One Roman emperor was called Caracalla, and that was a nickname for him because he wore a Germanic cloak from the north, and Caracalla was the name of that cloak. But at the time of Caracalla, the wearing of trousers was adopted, but before that the Romans wore togas, which were like long dresses, and now they're wearing trousers, tailored clothes. So the influence goes both ways. Not only did the Romans influence Scandinavia and the Germanic peoples, but the Germanic people influenced the Roman Empire as well. And here we can see some of these artifacts that are found in the Scandinavian grave goods and in the artifacts that they find. Here are Roman statues. Here are various artifacts that are made at this time of new prosperity. Notice down here on the right we have Roman coins that are found. These are German coins here, but on the right down here, this is a coin of Antoninus Pius, and this is Faustina the Younger, one of the queens in that reign. We also see a great proliferation of glass, which is a great luxury. This is Roman glass. You can see that it's Roman, it's not Scandinavian, and it's imported as luxury goods into the Scandinavian countries. So this is a sign of that great prosperity. Pliny the Elder wrote of the Bay Dodanus beyond Jutland and the island of Scandinavia, so that the Romans knew, Pliny the Elder was a great geographer, so the Romans knew about Scandinavia and they had knowledge of what was there. There are mentions by Roman explorers in Tacitus in his works the Agricola and the Germania, which describe the island of Skansa, and which would have been Scandinavia, and people that we can recognize as the Suevi, the Suini, and the Sve are the Swedes of Upland and the Cetones, who are described as having a woman ruler, which is interesting. Perhaps these are the Kvenir or the Dvanir of Eil's saga are describe the Finnish or the Lap word confused with an Old Norse word for woman. It is a sort of legendary tale of a woman ruler of the Cetones. Gotland and the Finns and the Lapps are all described in Tacitus Germania, and they're described accurately. I mean, you can recognize them and you can recognize the culture. For example, the Lapps herd reindeer, and they're a herding people, whereas the Scandinavians and the Germans farm their land, and so you can recognize them. The Germans, who are comprised of the Goths and other tribes, break off from Scandinavia about 100 BC, and they kind of clump together on the borders of the Roman Empire, and then gradually they sort of push into it. Julius Caesar, of course, conquers Gaul, but from the time of Caesar, Caesar encounters Germans. There's the formation of these clumps or colonies along the Roman frontier. Greek explorers like Ptolemy mention the Scandinavians. For example, Ptolemy says that east of Jutland are 4 islands called Scandia, inhabited by the Gautoi and the Chadinoi, and these are probably the Gautar and the Hednir of Hedmark in Norway. We glimpse also the Lapps and the Finns in Ptolemy's description. So there they are. They're already there, and they just sit there for a long time, virtually with their culture that changes very little. It fluctuates according to the amount of trade goods they can get from the Mediterranean, but their basic culture doesn't make enormous or swift changes. The Germans who move southward penetrate the Roman Empire, and what happens is there are now 6 centuries of silence about Scandinavia. Okay, the Germans move southward. The Roman Empire, I don't want to say it falls, because that is a misnomer to say Rome falls. What happens is, I like the idea to say that I like the concept of morphing. When you have a sort of photograph of something and an ear changes and a hairline changes and a smile changes and a nose changes, that's what happens to Rome. Little features of it change, and over a period of 5 centuries, it's become something different. But Rome doesn't fall. It evolves and it changes into something else. What it does is blend together with the Germanic cultures, and it becomes, at least the part of it that's in Europe becomes Europe. The part of it that is in the East becomes the New Eastern Roman Empire, or Byzantium. The part of it that's in the Far East becomes Islam. So Rome doesn't fall, it kind of morphs. And the Germans are the predominant ones in the West, in the area we call Europe. The German culture is described by Cassiodorus and Jordanus, both of whom wrote a history of the Goths, and they describe the Germans as coming from Scandinavia, so the Germans are related to the Scandinavians. Well, let me show you a few pictures to illustrate this. This is a 19th century drawing of Julius Caesar confronting one of the Germans. This is Vercingetorix, who is surrendering, but not very humbly, to Julius Caesar here, dressed in his toga in the middle of the wilderness with a Roman soldier. And of course, Vercingetorix is wearing trousers in Germanic dress. And here is the progress of the Germanic peoples coming from Scandinavia. They really moved from here in this area. We already mentioned the Angles and the Saxons going into England, but they're moving down into these areas. The Ostrogoths and the Visigoths and the Suetones and the Lombards go into this area, and Ostrogoths end up over here. And so here is all the movement of these Germanic tribes that actually originated in Scandinavia and share the same culture to a large degree. Okay, now we can see where they all settled on this map. We have the Visigothic kingdom here, the Suevi here, the Burgundians here, the Franks over here, the Saxons these are Saxons here that are also in the Angles and the Saxons in England. The Lombards over here. Later the Lombards come over here into Italy, and the Gepids over here. So we can see those Germanic tribes, and the Roman Empire, you know, changes into something new. So with the Germanic movement, we see the separation of Scandinavian culture into the Germans and the Scandinavians, but nevertheless in the north the original unity of the Scandinavian culture survives. And in Scandinavia they still speak only one language, and that is Old Norse. There is really no differentiation between Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. They all share the same language, the same culture, the same religion, the same concepts, the same values, the same lifestyle, and it's all very similar. It's only later that it differentiates after the Viking Age. We saw trading patterns in the Stone Age with the Mediterranean, and we saw trading patterns during the Roman Empire with the Mediterranean. Now, with the Roman Empire morphing into its heirs, Byzantium and Europe, trading patterns are developed with the Muslims. Meanwhile, the European culture was, as the Germanic cultures in Europe absorbed Roman culture and changed themselves, and as they became Christianized, they rather quickly, in historical terms, became quite different from Scandinavia. And so the feeling among Europeans was that the Scandinavians were barbarians. They didn't see them as their own relatives and sharing their own culture, because the Europeans, or the Germans who had settled in Europe, had become so different, especially because they were Christianized and Romanized. Meanwhile, the Scandinavians developed trading patterns with the Muslims, and their first contact with these new Europeans were through the empire of Charlemagne. In fact, Denmark, when Charlemagne started conquering its area, the large area that Charlemagne conquered, Denmark built a wall to keep the Carolingians out, to keep Charlemagne and his Frenchmen out. It's called the Danevirke, and it's a big earthwork. It's a wall across the base of Denmark to keep the Franks out. But meanwhile, Ivar the Far Wanderer was exploring in the area that was going to become Russia. Okay, so here we have the spread of the Muslim world, and as Charlemagne built his empire here, the Scandinavians traded more and more with the Muslims in this area, going down into the Black Sea and to Constantinople, but also to the Muslim world, building new trade works this way. And the Danevirke was, maybe I can point better with this, the Danevirke was right under here. Here is where the Danes built it. It was Gorm the Old who built it to keep Charlemagne out from conquering them. And it was Charlemagne's empire, which you can see here, that really fostered the first contact between these new Europeans who had evolved from the amalgamation of Rome and German cultures, the contact with the Scandinavians, okay, which is kind of where we'll start next time. Okay, I did end with a few minutes for discussion. If you have any questions, I really zoomed over this 10,000 years very quickly. We've covered 10,000 years. Any questions or thoughts about it that you might have?
What did we end chronologically about?
Where are we right now? We're up to Charlemagne's reign, which is in the late 700s, early 800s. But really, we're going to go back a little bit earlier to 750. I mentioned Ivar the Far Wanderer. He dates to 750. And he went into Russia exploring. He was the first one to go in that area. Any questions in West Houston?
Yes, I believe you referenced the course being available via KUHT.
Yes.
So what is the broadcast schedule for that?
Okay, the broadcast schedule is, I believe it's going to be Saturday night, Saturday morning at 1 a.m., which would be, wait, is that right, Libby?
It's either 1 or 3.
It's either at 1 or 3 a.m. Saturday morning. 1 or 3 a.m. You know what? The Houston Chronicle has it in their Sunday TV guide. They always list the classes that are being shown. If you look in the night time listings, the listings are there. But one of my classes is Friday morning and one of them is Saturday morning, and I think that the Vikings is Saturday morning. Yeah, okay. Also, if you miss a class, you can watch it on KUHT, or you can go to the library. There will be a tape in the library at 11 a.m. tomorrow morning after each lecture. If you miss one, it'll be in the library. But I really encourage you to come to class, and especially with your wonderful group of 4 people who can talk to each other and have discussions and trade notes and study together and things like that. So it's really good for you in West Houston to all come together on that night, on the night of the lecture. Any other questions, comments? Okay, we've tried to, no other questions? Okay, we've traced the Vikings very swiftly for 10,000 years, not the Vikings, but the pre-Viking culture, the pre-Viking Scandinavians. And next time, what are we doing next time? Let's see for my syllabus. Don't have it. Do you have the syllabus for the next week's topic?
Viking culture.
Oh, Viking culture. Okay. Okay, we'll start looking at Viking culture and Viking society, and we'll try to see how the Vikings lived and how they interacted and what their values were, and as much as we can in that direction. Okay, that's what we'll do next time. Okay, see you next week.